He looked at her arm. 1 second. Then he turned his wagon around and left. No explanation, no apology, no backward glance. Clara Bennett had crossed 300 miles on that man's promise. Letters, plans. A future written in careful ink over 12 months of hoping. And the moment he saw the scar, that old faded mark she had carried since she was 7 years old, he made his calculation, climbed back onto his wagon, and drove away without a single word. She stood on that platform holding her own arm. And she made a decision that would change everything. Subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment below telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The train had already pulled away. Clara could still feel the vibration of it in the soles of her worn leather boots, that deep mechanical shudder of something enormous moving on, carrying other people to other destinations, other lives. The platform of Silver Creek's tiny station had cleared within minutes. Families reunited, freight unloaded. The station master retreated to his booth with a coffee tin and a newspaper. And there she stood, 25 years old. One trunk, $3.40, and the particular humiliation of a woman who had let herself believe. She didn't cry. That was the first thing to understand about Clara Bennett. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she was especially not a woman who cried in front of strangers. What she did instead was straighten her spine, lift her chin exactly 1 inch, and stare at the road where Harlan Greer's wagon had disappeared into a rising cloud of summer dust. He hadn't even hesitated. That was what played on a loop in her mind as she stood there breathing steadily, refusing to give the two men lingering near the freight boxes the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. Harlan had stepped off his wagon with the careful, measured authority of a man who owned property and knew it. He'd removed his hat. He'd looked at her face, her ordinary, unremarkable face, and something had registered there. Recognition. Relief even. She'd been told she photographed well, and perhaps the photograph had been accurate enough. Then his eyes had dropped, not to her figure, not to her trunk, to her left forearm where the sleeve of her traveling dress had ridden up 2 inches during the business of climbing down from the train car. The scar was visible. It had always been visible to anyone who looked, a long silvered ridge of old skin that ran from her elbow toward her wrist, the remnant of a pot of boiling water that had tipped from a stove when she was 7 years old. She had stopped noticing it herself years ago. It was simply part of her arm, the way freckles were part of her nose. Harlan Greer had noticed it. She'd watched his expression travel from pleasant anticipation to something she could only describe as revision. The look of a man recalculating a transaction and finding the numbers no longer worked in his favor. He'd replaced his hat. He'd looked her in the eye one final time, and there was nothing in his gaze that she could have called cruelty exactly. It was more clinical than that, more final. "Miss Bennett," he'd said. Just those 2 words. And then he'd turned, climbed back onto his wagon, and driven away. She'd stood there, holding her own elbow, pressing her thumb over the scar, without realizing she was doing it. "Ma'am?" The voice belonged to the station master, a small, thin man of about 60 with wire spectacles and an expression of genuine discomfort, as though witnessing her abandonment had caused him physical pain. He was holding the station door open with one hand and gesturing vaguely with the other. "You're welcome to sit inside," he said, "out of the heat." "Thank you," Clara said. Her voice came out steady. She was distantly proud of that. She carried her own trunk inside. It wasn't heavy, containing as it did only the essentials of a life pared down to what could be transported, and sat on the wooden bench against the wall. The station master disappeared behind his counter and busied himself with something that required a great deal of shuffling paper. She understood he was giving her privacy, and she was grateful for it in the way that only a person who rarely receives small kindnesses understands how to be grateful. She counted her money. $3.40. Enough for a meal and perhaps a night in whatever passed for lodging in Silver Creek. Not enough for a train ticket back to Ohio. Not nearly enough for a new beginning anywhere else. She had spent nearly everything she had on the journey here. The ticket. The new dress sheet had made practical wool, nothing extravagant, but new. The cost of packaging and posting the letters month after month of letters, building a correspondence with a man she had never met, and would apparently prefer not to meet now that the full picture had been assessed and found wanting. Her late grandmother's voice rose up in her memory, clear and unhurried. The trouble with hope, Clara Jane, is that it costs you whether it pays off or not. She hadn't understood that when she was young. She understood it now. Pardon me. She looked up. The station master had drifted back to the near side of his counter, still not quite meeting her eyes, still arranging things that didn't need arranging. I don't mean to intrude, but that is to say, if your plans have perhaps changed. They have, Clara said simply. There are rooms above the general store, he said. Mrs. Halverson runs them, clean and reasonable, and I believe the seamstress on the next street is sometimes looking for help with alterations. Is there work available on any of the surrounding ranches? Clara asked. He blinked. Work for a woman. Cooking, nursing, household management. She kept her voice even. I'm capable of all three. I've managed a household since I was 12 years old. The station master shifted. Well, most ranchers hereabouts have their own arrangements, and a young woman traveling alone to a ranch that is people might... He stopped himself. Whatever concern he'd been navigating, he seemed to decide it wasn't his to voice. He cleared his throat instead. There's the Crosswind Ranch, he said after a moment, and something in his tone changed a drop in register that Clara read as reluctance. Several miles north. Fellow by the name of Ethan Walker owns it. He was in a pretty bad way last I heard. Had some kind of accident about 3 weeks back and nobody's seen him in town since. Men who came by said he was feverish, that there was infection. Clara was already straightening. He hasn't had a doctor. Doc Hennessy is over in Millard County until next week. And Walker... The station master hesitated. He's not the kind of man who asks for help easily. Never has been. Lost his wife 2 years ago. Since then, he's just been quiet. You understand? She understood better than he knew. She was intimately acquainted with the particular kind of quiet that came from loss, the way it settled into a house and changed the acoustics of every room. How far? She asked. Beg your pardon. How far is Crosswind Ranch? He stared at her for a moment over his spectacles. 7 miles, give or take. But Miss Bennett, you can't walk 7 miles in this heat. I walked the last 2 miles from the Dempsey station in March, Clara said, picking up her bonnet and tying it efficiently beneath her chin. In snow. She stood. She smoothed her skirt. She looked at the station master with the calm, matter-of-fact expression of a woman who had already done the math and arrived at the only reasonable conclusion. Could I leave my trunk here until I know my situation? She asked. Of course, he said faintly. Of course you can. Thank you, Mr. Briggs, he said. Arthur Briggs. Thank you, Mr. Briggs. She picked up the small bag that held her nursing supplies, her grandmother's collection of dried herbs, clean bandaging cloth, a bottle of carbolic solution, a few basic instruments she'd acquired over years of caring for neighbors and relatives alike, and she walked out into the summer heat without looking back. 10. The road to Crosswind Ranch was not kind. Clara had grown up in rural Ohio, which meant she understood distance and heat and the particular loneliness of long roads between properties. What she had not accounted for was the specific quality of Montana summer, the way the heat came at you from all directions, at once bouncing up from the packed earth road as aggressively as it pressed down from above. There was no tree cover on this stretch. There was only the road pale and relentless, and the scrub on either side, and the occasional sound of something moving in the brush that she chose not to investigate. She walked steadily. She did not rush because rushing would exhaust her, and exhaustion helped no one. She rationed the water in her canteen. She kept her mind focused not on how far she'd come, or how far remained, but on the immediate practical question of what she might find when she arrived. 3 weeks with a fever and an infected wound. No doctor, no household help, no one checking in. Her grandmother had taught her everything she knew about the body's willingness to fight and its limits. Infection left untreated had a trajectory. She had seen it in neighbors. She had seen it in her father, who had survived a farming accident through sheer obstinacy, and her grandmother's relentless intervention. She knew the stages with a clinical clarity that sat uncomfortably alongside the fact that she was walking toward a stranger's ranch, because she had nowhere else to go. She didn't examine that discomfort. There was no productive outcome to examining it. When Crosswind Ranch finally came into view, she stopped walking for exactly 5 seconds. She assessed. The fencing along the road was down in 2 places. The cattle she could see were clustered near the water trough without human direction managing themselves, which suggested they'd been doing so for some time. The vegetable garden beside the house was barely recognizable as such. A door on the barn hung at an angle that suggested a broken hinge. Everything about the property said the person responsible for this has been absent. Clara walked through the open gate and knocked on the cabin door. Nothing. She knocked again harder. "Mr. Walker? My name is Clara Bennett. I'm not here to cause any trouble. Arthur Briggs at the station mentioned you might need some assistance." A long silence. Then from inside, a sound, not quite a voice, not quite a groan, but something that registered as human. Clara opened the door. The smell hit her first, and she controlled her reaction to it with the discipline of long practice. Fever had a smell. Infection had a smell. She knew both, and she knew what they meant together. Ethan Walker was on the bed, if you could call it that. He had half fallen from it at some point, and not fully recovered his position, so he was lying at a diagonal with one arm off the edge and his boots still on. He was somewhere between 30 and 40, she estimated, with the kind of face that had been shaped by outdoor work, angular and weathered, and currently sheened with the particular pallor of sustained illness. The bandaging on his left leg had not been changed in what looked like several days, and the cloth showed the greenish-yellow discoloration that told her everything she needed to know about the state of the wound beneath it. His eyes opened. They were dark brown or dark gray, she couldn't tell in the light, and they focused on her with visible effort. "Who?" His voice came out ruined, parched. "Who are you?" "Clara Bennett," she said again, moving toward him. "I'm going to need you to stay still and let me look at that wound. You need to—" He made an attempt to sit up, a heroic and entirely unsuccessful effort, that she stopped with a firm hand on his shoulder. He was burning beneath her palm. "You need to leave. There's no one here." "I'm here," Clara said. "Lie still." He stared at her with the bewildered expression of a man whose fever had perhaps been arguing for some time that things happening around him were not quite real. She set her bag on the nearest chair and began removing what she needed. "I'm going to take off the bandage," she told him, because her grandmother had taught her that people tolerated discomfort better when they knew what was coming. "It's going to hurt. I need you to hold on to something and not fight me." "Lady," Ethan Walker said with impressive clarity, for a man in his condition, "I don't even know your name." "Clara Bennett, I told you twice. Hold on to the bedpost." His hand found the bedpost. His jaw set. She removed the bandage. It was bad. Not beyond saving, she had seen worse, but bad enough that another few days without treatment would have made the question academic. The wound itself appeared to be from a deep cut, perhaps a tool, or a piece of machinery along the outside of his lower left leg. The infection had moved outward from the original site, and the tissue surrounding it was angry and swollen and entirely in need of intervention. "How long has it been since anyone cleaned this?" she asked, working steadily, her hands sure. A pause. 4, maybe 5 days. "And how long since you ate anything?" Longer pause. "I don't remember." "All right." She worked in silence for a moment, cleaning with the carbolic solution, removing the worst of it. Ethan made almost no sound through the process, which she found notable. Either he was too far gone to register the pain properly, or he had the kind of stubborn physical discipline that sometimes ran in men who'd spent years working alone. "Mr. Walker, is there anyone I should send word to family?" "No. No family or no one you'd want me to contact." His eyes had been closed, They opened again, and the look in them was the look she had seen in her father, in aging neighbors, in anyone who had retreated so far into self-sufficiency that the idea of asking for help had become genuinely foreign. "Both," he said. "All right," she said again. She applied the herbal poultice her grandmother had taught her, a drawing compound of plantain and yarrow that pulled infection outward, and rebandaged the wound with clean cloth. She got water into him. Not as much as she wanted, because his system would reject too much at once, but enough. She found the small stove, found wood, found the larder, which had very little in it, but enough for broth. She built a fire. She made broth. She brought it to him and made him drink it slowly, while she sat in the chair beside the bed and watched his color to see whether it shifted. He watched her in return. "You said your name was Bennett," he said, after the broth was half gone. His voice was slightly clearer now. Not better, not yet, but with the edge of lucidity that fluids and rest could temporarily restore. "Clara Bennett, yes." "You're not from here." "Ohio," she said. "What are you doing in Silver Creek?" She kept her eyes on the mug. "I had plans that changed." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Harlan Greer." She looked up at that. Something crossed his expression. Not pity, which she would have resented, but a specific recognition. "I heard he was expecting a woman," Ethan said. "From the Post. A correspondence." He stopped. Looked at her with those dark, fever-worn eyes. "He didn't." "He did," Clara said pleasantly. A silence. Outside, one of the cattle made a sound, a low carrying call that echoed once and died. "I'm sorry," Ethan Walker said. "Don't be," she said. "It appears to have led me somewhere useful." She nodded toward his leg. "Drink the rest of that." He drank the rest of that. She didn't sleep that first night. She had slept briefly in the chair beside his bed, waking every time he shifted, or his breathing changed. 3 times she had gotten up to check the wound twice to get more water into him once, because his temperature spiked in the small hours of the morning, and she had to cool him down with a damp cloth and the concentrated patience of someone who understood that panic helped nothing. By morning the fever had not broken, but it had stabilized. The wound was no worse. He was breathing evenly. Clara stood outside the cabin door in the early light, the sun not yet fully up. The air still carrying the relative cool of the night, and she let herself feel tired for exactly 2 minutes. She ate half a biscuit she'd found in the larder. She drank water. She stood still. Then she went back inside. There were animals that needed attending. She had grown up with cattle and chickens, and one deeply opinionated horse. And while Crosswind Ranch's livestock situation was more complicated than her childhood home, the principles were the same. She fed what she could find, feed for. She checked the water trough. She secured the barn door as best she could with the tools she found in the barn itself. She was coming back toward the cabin when the sound of a horse on the road made her stop. The rider pulled up at the gate, a broad-shouldered man of about 40, with the kind of face that had opinions about things and expressed them freely. He looked at Clara with an expression that moved through surprise into something more calculating. "Who are you?" he said. "Clara Bennett. And you?" "Pete Culver. I own the property north of here." He didn't dismount. He looked at the cabin, then back at her. "Where's Walker?" "Resting. He's been quite ill. I'm attending to him." "Attending to him," Pete Culver repeated in a tone that suggested he was assembling a particular interpretation of those words. "You a nurse?" "Among other things," Clara said. "Is there something I can help you with, Mr. Culver?" He looked at her for a long moment, with the speculative attention of a man filing something away. "Just checking in on the neighbor," he said finally. "Hadn't seen him in town. You know how long you'll be here." "Until he's well enough to manage on his own," Clara said. Pete Culver touched his hat, turned his horse, and rode back the way he'd come. Clara watched him go, and registered with the quiet precision of a woman who had spent her life reading rooms, that something about that exchange was going to matter later. She went inside. Kya. By the third day, the fever broke. She was in the middle of changing the dressing. When it happened, she saw the change in him, the way the quality of his sweat shifted and the rigidity in his face eased, and she put her hand to his forehead and felt the temperature drop beneath her palm like a tide going out. His eyes opened properly for the first time, focused, clear. He looked at her. "You're still here," he said. "I'm still here," Clara confirmed. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at his leg, at the clean dressing at the small table beside the bed where her supplies were arranged with the orderly efficiency that she brought to every task. He looked at the stove where broth was warming. He looked at the window where the late afternoon light came through. "You fixed the curtain," he said. "The rod was loose. It wasn't difficult." "I've been meaning to fix that for 2 years." Clara said nothing because there was nothing to say to that. She understood what he wasn't saying, that there were things in a house that a person stopped seeing when there was no longer anyone else to see them with. "How long?" he asked. 3 days. "You've been here 3 days?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, processing this with the careful attention of a man returning to a world that had continued without him. "The cattle," he said, "fed and watered. The situation in the barn is improving, though there's a fence section on the east side that needs proper repair. I've done what I could with what was available, but it needs more than I can manage alone." He stared at her. "You?" "My father raised cattle in Ohio, Mr. Walker. I'm not entirely useless outdoors." He closed his eyes again. "Why?" he said. Not aggressively, not suspiciously. The question was genuine, the bewildered query of a man who had concluded that the world operated according to certain rules, and what was happening appeared to violate several of them. "Why did you stay?" Clara finished securing the bandage. She straightened. She looked at him with the direct, steady gaze that people sometimes found unsettling, and she had long since stopped apologizing for. "You were going to die," she said simply. "And I was here." He opened his eyes. "That's all?" "That's all." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his expression that she didn't try to identify or name. It wasn't gratitude exactly. Gratitude had a particular texture, a warmth and a slight embarrassment that she recognized. This was something quieter, something that had not yet decided what it was. "There are biscuits," he said finally. She blinked. "I'm sorry. In the pantry, tin on the second shelf." A pause. "My neighbor, Mrs. Aldrich, brought them 2 weeks ago, before—" He stopped. "They're probably stale." "I'll find them," she said. She found them. They were stale. She soaked them in the broth she'd been making and served them back to him with the matter-of-fact efficiency that was simply how she did things, and Ethan Walker ate 3 of them without speaking, and watched her the entire time with those dark, newly clear eyes. Later, when she had washed the bowl and he was sleeping properly, real sleep, not fever sleep, the deep and quiet kind that meant the body was finally doing its repair work, Clara sat in the chair by the window and permitted herself the thought she had been refusing all day. She didn't know what came next. She had $3.40 at the station. She had a place to sleep, the small back room that had apparently been used for storage, where she had cleared a space for herself with her characteristic quiet efficiency. She had a patient who was improving and would within the week begin to need her less. And then what? She pressed her thumb over the scar on her arm. The habit of a lifetime. Outside, the evening was settling over Crosswind Ranch with the particular quality of Montana dusk, a slow, purpling depth that had no equivalent back east. She could hear cattle. She could hear wind. She could hear the sound of a place that was against all recent evidence still alive. She had come here with nowhere to go. She had knocked on a stranger's door because the only alternative was standing still. And now she was here in this worn chair in this quiet house with the specific and inexplicable sensation of having arrived somewhere. She didn't know what that meant. She wasn't going to try to name it. She closed her eyes just for a moment. And for the first time in a very long time, She slept without dreaming of leaving. On the 5th day, Ethan Walker stood up. He did it without asking for help. She heard the sound of it from the other room, the careful maneuvering, the sharp intake of breath, when he put weight on the bad leg, and she came to the doorway and watched him stand in the middle of the cabin with both hands braced on the chairback, breathing hard and upright. He looked at her. "Don't say it," he said. "I wasn't going to say anything," Clara said. "You were going to tell me to sit back down. I was going to ask if you wanted coffee." He held her gaze for a moment, and something happened, a slight shift, a fractional adjustment, like two things that had been misaligned, finding a more natural position relative to each other. "Yes," he said. "I'd like coffee." She made coffee. He stood at the window and drank it, looking out at the ranch with the expression of a man tallying damage. She stood at the table and drank hers and waited for whatever was coming. "You told me the east fence needs work," he said. "It does. The northwest corner of the vegetable garden also needs attention. I've kept up with what was there, but 2 of the rows should be replanted if you want anything from them before the season ends." "You know about gardens." "I know about most things that need doing," she said. "My grandmother believed in comprehensive education." He turned from the window. The morning light fell across him differently now that the fever pallor was lifting. She could see the person he was when he was healthy, or had been before, whatever had knocked him down. A steady-looking man. Not handsome in any conventional sense, but with the kind of face that would be the same at 60 as it was at 30-something in the bone structure that didn't depend on youth. "Clara Bennett," he said, "who came here to marry Harlan Greer." She met his gaze levelly. "Who came here to marry Harlan Greer," she confirmed. "And he left, yes. Because of your arm." It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. Presumably, he didn't provide an explanation. Ethan Walker looked at her arm. Not with Harlan's rapid assessment, not the calculation of a man running numbers, but with a different quality of attention. Quiet. Direct. The way he might look at a fence post that had taken weather and remained standing. "That must have been humiliating," he said. "It was," Clara said. "I prefer not to dwell on it." "All right," he said, and returned to looking out the window. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. The letter arrived on the 7th day. It came via one of the Culver ranch hands who delivered it to the gate with the particular care of someone who knows they're carrying information and is curious about the reaction to it. Clara took it, thanked the man, and waited until he'd ridden away before she turned it over. It was addressed to Ethan. The return address was a law office in Billings. She brought it inside and set it on the table without a word. Ethan read it standing up because he was doing most things standing up now, refusing the chair as though sitting were a form of defeat. She watched his expression, not prying, but attentive, because his expressions told her things about how he was recovering that his words didn't. What she saw was not what she expected. He read the letter twice. He folded it. He set it down on the table, with the deliberate care of a man managing something he didn't want to drop. "My wife's brother," he said to the room, rather than to her specifically. "He's been claiming partial ownership of the ranch since she died. Says the deed was improperly filed." A pause. "There's to be a hearing in 6 weeks." Clara was quiet. "If I can't prove the deed is sound," Ethan continued in the same flat, controlled tone, "he can force a sale." He looked up. "He's been trying to push me out since the funeral." "Do you have documentation?" Clara asked. "I have paperwork. I don't know what all of it says. Legal language isn't—" He stopped. "May I look at it?" she said. He stared at her. "Why would you—" "Because I'm here," Clara said with the same simplicity she'd offered 3 days ago. "And I can read." Something happened in his expression that she was beginning to recognize, not quite a smile, not quite surprise, but a recalibration. A quiet acknowledgement that the world had once again operated in a way he hadn't predicted. "I'll get the box," he said. She pulled her chair closer to the table. Outside, the Montana afternoon was bright and ordinary and entirely indifferent to the specific weight of what had just been placed in front of them both. She was still here. She had no plan beyond that, but her hands were steady on the table, and the papers were coming, and somehow in the way that sometimes the most important decisions of a life are made not with grand intention, but with the simple accumulation of small choices to stay. Something had already begun. The papers were a disaster. Clara had been sitting at the table for 2 hours, with Ethan's document box open in front of her, sorting through the accumulated legal correspondence of a man who had clearly never trusted lawyers and had consequently allowed paperwork to pile up with the same studied neglect he applied to everything that didn't involve cattle or fencing. There were letters half answered and then abandoned. There were documents that needed signatures from 3 years ago. There was a deed, the original deed to Crosswind Ranch, folded into quarters and tucked beneath a broken pocket watch, as though its importance had been filed under things I'll deal with when I have time. Ethan stood across the room, watching her the way a person watches someone handle something fragile. "How bad?" he said. "The deed itself is valid," Clara said without looking up. "The filing date is clear. The problem is here." She lifted a document and turned it toward him. "Your brother-in-law's attorney is arguing that your wife's signature was obtained under duress, that she signed her rights over to you before the marriage was formally recorded. That's not what happened. I believe you. The question is whether you can prove it." He crossed the room and stood beside her, looking at the document over her shoulder. He was close enough that she could feel the residual warmth of a body still fighting its way back from fever. She kept her eyes on the paper. "There was a witness," he said. "The minister who married us, Reverend Calloway. He was there when Ruth signed. Is he still in the area?" "He moved to Helena 2 years ago, maybe more. Write to him," Clara said immediately. "Today. Explain what you need and why. A sworn statement from a minister carries weight with a judge." She set the document down and picked up the next one. "You also need to respond to this hearing notice within the next 10 days, or you forfeit your right to present a defense." "I didn't know that." "That's likely what they counted on." He was quiet. She felt him looking at the side of her face rather than the papers. "Where did you learn to read legal documents?" he said. "My father had land disputes twice when I was growing up," Clara said. "Both times he couldn't afford proper legal representation. Both times I sat beside him and read every document out loud until we understood what we were dealing with." She turned to the next page. "The second time we won." Ethan pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. Not because he was tired. The way he moved now was different from a week ago, more deliberate, the careful economy of a man relearning the geography of his own body, but with the intention of a man who had decided to stop watching and start participating. "Tell me what else I need," he said. She told him. They worked until the light went bad. By the time Clara set the last document down, they had a list. A specific, ordered, actionable list of what needed to happen before the hearing in Billings, and in what sequence. The letter to Reverend Calloway was drafted. The response to the court notice was outlined. 3 supporting documents had been identified that Ethan hadn't realized were relevant, and that she had pulled from the pile and set in their own stack, with the organized certainty of someone who processed information systematically and completely. Ethan read through the response she'd drafted and said nothing for a long moment. "This is good," he said finally. "It's a start," Clara said. "You should have an actual lawyer review it before it's filed. Lawyers cost money. Losing the ranch costs more." He looked at her. She looked back at him. It was the particular kind of standoff that happens between two people who are both accustomed to being the most practically minded person in any given room, a brief mutual recognition. "I'll write to the attorney in town," he said. "Do it tomorrow," she said. "First thing." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and there was something in his voice, dry but not unkind, that was the first thing she had heard from him that wasn't gravity or pain or careful courtesy. She filed it away without comment. She began organizing the documents back into the box in the order they'd need them. You didn't eat today, Ethan said. She stopped. He was right. She'd had coffee in the morning and half a biscuit somewhere around noon, and then the papers had absorbed everything. I'll eat now, she said. There's nothing to eat, he said flatly. I know what's in this house, Miss Bennet. There's broth base and 3 potatoes and half a bag of flour. That's what I've been living on for 3 weeks, and you've been here 7 days sharing it. A pause. I need to get to town. You're not riding to town yet. I'm not asking your permission. Your wound reopened this morning, Clara said. You thought I didn't notice. I noticed. You're doing better, Mr. Walker, but you're not doing well enough to ride 7 miles and back on a horse. Not yet. He stared at her. She waited. Then we need someone to bring supplies, he said. I can walk into town. You're not walking 7 miles into Silver Creek and 7 miles back, he said, and the firmness in his voice was not arguable. That's not happening. Clara looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the studied blankness of a man managing pain. Not the focused attention of someone processing legal documents, but something that had edges to it. Something that she recognized distantly. The beginning of the specific kind of protectiveness that a person develops without intending to. She didn't address it directly. The Culver Ranch hand who brought the letter yesterday, she said. Would he carry a supply list to the general store and bring back an order? For a fee he would, Ethan said. Then write the list, Clara said. And I'll go find a way to get the message to him. I'll write the list. He wrote the list. It was a thorough list. The list of a man who knew exactly what a working ranch required, and had been watching those supplies dwindle with the specific anguish of someone who could see the problem clearly and had been too ill to address it. Clara read it over. Added 4 things he'd missed, including the yarrow she needed to keep treating the wound, and took it out to the road. The Culver Ranch hand. His name was Billy, she learned, and he was about 19 years old and easily charmed into helpfulness by anyone who thanked him clearly and without condescension agreed to take the list and return with the supplies the following afternoon. She came back inside to find Ethan standing at the window again. He'll come tomorrow, she said. Good. He didn't turn around. Clara. It was the first time he'd used her name without the miss. She registered it the way you register a change in temperature, not dramatically, but certainly. Yes, she said. You've been sleeping in the storage room, he said. It's adequate. It's not adequate. It's a storage room. He turned around. There's a second bedroom. Ruth's. He stopped. Reorganized. The room at the end of the hall. It hasn't been used in 2 years, but it's a proper room with a proper bed. Clara looked at him. Mr. Walker. You're not a guest passing through, he said. You've been here a week. You've been up at 3 in the morning changing my dressings and making broth in the dark and feeding my cattle at sunrise. Something moved across his face, something he was clearly not entirely comfortable with, but had decided to say anyway. You should sleep somewhere that isn't the floor. She wanted to tell him she managed fine. She wanted to say the storage room was perfectly acceptable. She wanted to say all the things that a woman who had grown up managing with less than she deserved had learned to say. She said instead, All right. The room might need airing out, he said. I'll air it out. There are Ruth's things, or I haven't. He stopped again. I won't disturb anything, Clara said quietly. I'll just sleep there. He nodded once, turned back to the window, and that was the end of it. But the quality of the silence afterward was different, less careful, less provisional. Like something that had been balanced on an edge, had settled finally into a more stable position. The supply delivery. The next afternoon brought more than supplies. Billy arrived with the order from the general store, and behind him, uninvited, and yet somehow entirely unsurprising, Pete Culver rode in on a gray horse with the confident bearing of a man who considers neighboring land an extension of his own territory. Clara came out to meet them. Miss Bennet, Culver said with a pleasant smile that didn't reach his eyes. I see you're still here. I see you've noticed, she said, equally pleasant. "Ran into some people in town when I passed through this morning." He swung down from the horse. "People who are curious about the situation out here." "What situation is that?" "An unmarried woman living alone on a man's property." Culver spread his hands, a gesture of innocent inquiry that was she recognized nothing of the kind. "People talk in a small town, Miss Bennett. No judgment from me. I just thought Walker ought to know." "Mr. Walker is aware I'm here," Clara said. "He's recovering from a significant infection, which is why I'm here. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get these supplies inside before the butter melts." "I'll carry them in," Billy offered, already lifting a crate. "Thank you, Billy," she said. Culver hadn't moved. He was looking at the cabin with an expression of speculative assessment, the same look she thought that he'd given her on his first visit. "How is Walker?" "Improving." "Glad to hear it." He paused. "You planning to stay on long?" "As long as I'm needed," she said. "Right," Culver said. He mounted his horse with the ease of long practice. "Just so you know, Miss Bennett, there are proper lodgings in town. Mrs. Halverson's rooms, clean and respectable." He looked at her with a smile that was carefully constructed to appear kind. "For a woman on her own." "I'll keep that in mind," Clara said. She watched him ride away with the same still attention she'd given Harlan Greer's departing wagon a week ago. A different kind of dismissal. The same underlying message, you don't belong here. She picked up the remaining supplies and went inside. Ethan was at the table, having heard the exchange through the open window. He looked at her when she came in. She set the supplies down without looking at him. "He'll talk in town," she said simply. "He already has," Ethan said. "That's why he came." She began unpacking the crate. "Does it concern you?" A pause. "Does it concern you?" She kept her hands moving, unpacking, organizing, finding places for things that had no place, because the kitchen had been without a guiding system for 2 years. "What concerns me," she said carefully, "is whether it affects your position, legally or socially. Whether the people who'll be present at that hearing in Billings will have heard stories beforehand that color how they see you." "That's not what I asked." She stopped. She turned and looked at him directly. "Yes?" she said. "It concerns me." "Why?" "Because I know how stories work," she said. "I watched Harlan Greer walk away from me on that platform, and within 10 minutes, 2 men at the freight dock had an opinion about why." She turned back to the crate. "Stories travel faster than facts and hit harder. I know that." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You could go into town," he said. "Take a room at Halverson's. Come out here each day to check the wound until I'm fully recovered. That would take twice as long and accomplish half as much." "Clara." She turned. "I'm not asking you to leave," he said. "I'm telling you I wouldn't blame you if you did." She looked at him. He looked back. He was still pale beneath the weathering, still moving with the careful deliberation of a body that hadn't fully reclaimed itself. But his eyes were entirely clear, and what was in them was not pity, not guilt, not the careful courtesy of a man discharging an obligation. It was honesty, plain and direct, and a little uncomfortable. "I know," she said. "I'm not leaving." She went back to unpacking. After a moment she heard his chair shift, the sound of him settling back into it, the slight exhalation of a man releasing something he'd been holding. "There are eggs," he said, looking at the supplies. "I haven't had eggs in 3 weeks." "There are eggs," Clara confirmed. Do you know how to—" "Mr. Walker," she said without turning around. "I can cook eggs." "I wasn't doubting," he said. "I was hoping." She made eggs. She made them simply fried in butter, seasoned with salt, served hot, and they ate at the table together for the first time without the specific gravity of medical necessity overhead. Just 2 people eating breakfast improbably in the middle of a situation that neither of them had planned for. It was almost ordinary. Almost. Over the following days, a shape began to emerge from the chaos of the neglected ranch. Not dramatic, not sudden but steady in the way that consistent work is always steady. Clara mapped the problems systematically. The vegetable garden needed the most immediate attention because the growing season wouldn't extend indefinitely, and whatever could be salvaged and replanted now was food against winter. She worked it in the mornings before the heat peaked, moving with the focused efficiency of someone who had always understood that effort not spent now was a problem compounded later. Ethan watched her from the fence line. He could stand and walk without assistance now, though the wound required another week before he'd be able to mount a horse safely, and she could feel him trying to decide whether to offer help or stay out of her way. She solved it by handing him a hoe. "The middle rows," she said. "Carefully, don't strain the leg." He took the hoe without comment and worked the middle rows with the measured care of a man who had accepted that doing half the job was better than watching someone else do all of it. "You know what you're doing," he said after a while. "So do you," she said. "I haven't touched this garden since." He stopped, started again. "Ruth grew things. She was better at the growing than I was. I was better with the cattle, and she was better with the growing." A pause. "After she died, I let it go." "That's understandable," Clara said. "It was stupid," he said. "Practically speaking." "Both things can be true." He looked at her. "Grief isn't practical," she said, without stopping her work. "It doesn't mean the person grieving is stupid. It means they're human." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You've lost someone." "My grandmother," Clara said. "When I was 19. She raised me after my mother died, raised me the way some people build houses. Carefully, with good materials, making sure everything was solid." She moved to the next row. "When she was gone, I let the house go too, metaphorically speaking." "How did you come back from it?" "I got up one morning," Clara said, "and I made her bread recipe. I'd never made it alone before. It wasn't as good as hers, but it was bread." Ethan Walker stood in the middle of the garden with a hoe in his hand and looked at her with an expression that she filed away carefully without examining it too closely. "Practical," he said. "Practical." She agreed. They worked until noon. The letter from Reverend Calloway arrived 12 days after they'd sent it. Clara heard Ethan's boots on the porch. He was walking fully now, the limp subsiding, and looked up from the mending she'd been doing on the chair by the window. He came in holding the letter with the careful tension of a man braced for news he wasn't sure he could handle. She waited. He read it. He read it a second time. He set it on the table and looked at it as though confirming it was real. "He remembers," Ethan said. "All of it. He kept records. He says he has the original witness documentation from the land transfer and the marriage kept in his personal files in Helena." A pause. "He'll provide a sworn statement." "That's what you needed," Clara said. "That's yes." He exhaled a long, controlled breath that carried more relief than he'd probably intended to show. "That's what we needed." She noticed he'd said we. She didn't comment on it. "You should send that to the attorney in town immediately," she said, "and write back to Calloway today asking him to send the documentation directly to the court in Billings." "Already thinking it through," he said. "I know. I'm saying it anyway." He looked at her with the fractional adjustment she'd come to recognize. "You always say things anyway." "Habit," she said. "Does it bother you?" "No," he said simply. And then after a pause, "No one said things anyway in this house for 2 years." She let that sit without prodding it. Some things were better received than examined. "Write the letter," she said. "I'll have dinner ready by the time you're done." He sat at the table and began writing. She went to the kitchen. Outside, the cattle were quiet. The garden was growing. The fence on the east side was repaired. She'd managed it with Billy's help 2 days ago, the boy having become a reliable presence whenever she found a task that required a second pair of hands. The ranch was not healed, but it was healing. She stood at the stove and measured out flour with practiced hands and let herself quietly and without announcement feel something she hadn't felt since the platform in Silver Creek. Not happy, not yet, or not in any simple sense, but settled. Like water that had been disturbed and was finally finding its level again. She had just put the biscuits in when she heard the horse outside. Not Billy, not Culver's measured trot. A different horse moving faster, pulling up hard at the gate. Ethan was at the window before she reached the door. "Who is it?" she asked. His jaw had set. "Gerald Marsh," he said. "My wife's brother." Gerald Marsh was not what Clara had expected from the letters. The letters had suggested a calculating man, methodical patient, the kind of person who works legal angles rather than direct confrontation. The man who came through the gate on a black horse was none of those things on the surface. He was perhaps 45, well-dressed by frontier standards, with the kind of confident open face that belonged to men who had never had to work very hard to be believed. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Clara. His expression moved through a rapid sequence of assessments. "Walker," he said, swinging down. "Heard you'd been sick." "Gerald," Ethan said. His voice was entirely flat. "Also heard you had company." Marsh looked at Clara with a smile that was perfectly shaped. "I don't believe we've met." "Clara Bennett," she said. "Miss Bennett." He turned back to Ethan. "I've come to discuss the hearing." "My attorney will discuss the hearing. You hired an attorney." Something moved behind Marsh's eyes, surprise recalculated. "I thought we might handle this between family." "We're not family," Ethan said. "Ruth was my family. You are someone who's been trying to take my land since the week we buried her." Marsh spread his hands with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to seeming reasonable in the face of accusations. "That's unfair, Ethan. I'm only trying to protect Ruth's legacy." "Ruth's legacy is this ranch," Ethan said, "which she signed over to me freely and with a witness before a minister before our marriage was recorded. You know that. Your attorney knows that. The only thing that's changed is that now I have documentation to prove it in court." Clara watched Marsh process this. The smile remained, but it adjusted the way a calculation adjusts when a new variable enters the equation. "I see you've been busy," he said. And this time he looked at Clara with something different in his expression. Not the social assessment of before. Something more pointed. "Miss Bennett has been a considerable help," Ethan said. "I imagine she has," Marsh said in a tone so carefully neutral that it said everything it was pretending not to say. Ethan took one step forward. It wasn't aggressive. It was simply definitive. The movement of a man repositioning himself in space to make certain things very clear about the space. "Say what you've come to say," he said. "Or ride back the way you came." Marsh looked at him for a long moment. Then the smile returned warmer and more genuine, and therefore more dangerous than the others. "I only came to see how you were recovering," he said, "and to let you know that the hearing date may be moved. My attorney is requesting a later date. More time to gather evidence." "More time to find complications," Clara said. Both men looked at her. She looked back at Marsh with the same calm, direct gaze she'd turned on Pete Culver. "If your case had merit, you'd want the earlier date. Requesting more time is a delay strategy. It means you've seen something in the response to the notice that concerns you." Marsh looked at her for a long moment. "You're well informed for a—" "A what?" she said pleasantly. He stopped, reorganized. "For someone who arrived recently," he said. "I read quickly," Clara said. Ethan was looking at her with an expression she caught only at the edge of her vision. Something in it that she would have called approval if she'd been the kind of person who needed approval. She wasn't. But she registered it anyway. "We'll see you in court, Gerald," Ethan said. Marsh mounted his horse. He paused at the gate, the particular pause of a man delivering a final observation. "That scar on your arm, Miss Bennett," he said in the same pleasantly neutral tone. "Distinctive. I'd imagine a woman traveling alone should be careful about being too visible." The pause after he rode away was very still. Ethan turned to her. "That was a threat," she said before he could speak. "Yes," Ethan said. "He's going to use me," she said. "The fact that I'm here, the talk in town that Culver started. He's going to bring it into the hearing as a way to undermine your credibility. I know. That means you need to address it before he does. She turned and went back inside. Finish your letter to the attorney. Tell him about Marsh's visit. Tell him what Culver has been saying in town. Get ahead of it. Ethan followed her inside. Clara. She stopped. Turned. Are you frightened? He said. She considered the question with genuine honesty rather than reflexive reassurance. No, she said. I've been underestimated my entire life. I'm accustomed to it. She held his gaze. Are you? He thought about it. I was, he said. Before the fever. I'd gotten very comfortable with things going wrong. And now, he looked around the kitchen. The organized supplies, the biscuits in the oven that were going to be done in 8 minutes, the mended curtain, the stacked documents, the clean table where 2 people had been working together toward something with shared purpose for the past 2 weeks. Now, he said, I'm not. She turned back to the stove. Her hands were completely steady. Then write the letter, she said. He sat down and wrote the letter. Outside, the afternoon continued ordinary and fragile, and full of the particular kind of possibility that doesn't announce itself, that simply grows in the space between 2 people, learning to trust the same ground. The biscuits came out right. The attorney's name was Douglas Hale, and he arrived at Crosswind Ranch on a Tuesday morning with a leather satchel, a good hat, and the careful expression of a man who had read Ethan's letter 3 times and was still deciding what to make of it. Clara made coffee. She set it on the table and sat down without being invited to, because the documents she'd organized were in the box beside her chair, and she was the one who knew where everything was. Hale looked at her with the particular assessment of a man recalibrating the situation he'd walked into. Miss Bennett has been managing the documentation, Ethan said without preamble. I see, Hale said. She also drafted the initial response to the court notice, Ethan said, which I'd like you to review. Hale took the draft. He read it. He read it a second time more slowly, and Clara watched his expression move from professional courtesy into something more genuine. You wrote this, he said to her. I did, she said. Where did you study law? I didn't, she said. I read documents. There's a difference. Hale set the draft down and looked at Ethan. She's right about the deed filing date, and the argument regarding the witness testimony is solid. If Calloway delivers what he's promised, Marsh's claim falls apart at its foundation. He picked up his coffee. The problem isn't the legal case. Then what is it? Ethan said. Hale set his cup down with the care of a man about to say something he'd rather not. Gerald Marsh was in Silver Creek last Friday. He had dinner at the hotel with Judge Pearson. The room went quiet. Pearson is hearing this case, Ethan said. He's the circuit judge for this district, Hale said. We don't get to choose. And Marsh had dinner with him, publicly, openly, which means either he's not concerned about appearances or he's very confident about the outcome. Hale glanced at Clara, then back to Ethan. He's also been talking to people in town about the situation here. He's framing it as a question of character. Whose character? Ethan said, though from the set of his jaw he already knew. Both of yours, Hale said, but Miss Bennett's more specifically. Clara had known this was coming since the moment Gerald Marsh had looked at her scar and smiled that careful smile. She kept her hands flat on the table and her expression entirely neutral. What is he saying? Hale had the decency to look uncomfortable. That a woman of uncertain background and unknown history arrived at this ranch under irregular circumstances. That her presence here is inappropriate. And that a man who would allow such a situation is perhaps not a man whose word should be taken on matters of property and legal obligation. That's a very clean way of calling us both liars, Clara said. Yes, Hale said. It is. Ethan stood up from the table. He moved to the window, not dramatically, but with the particular controlled movement of a man managing something very hot in his hands. What do we do? It wasn't a question. It was a demand addressed to the room. The legal case is strong, Hale said. Calloway's documentation, if it arrives intact, should be decisive. But Marsh is working a second strategy, one that doesn't need to win in court to cause damage. If he creates enough talk about Miss Bennet's presence here, he undermines your standing in this community regardless of the verdict. So he wins either way, Clara said. He's trying to arrange it so that he does, Hale said. She looked at Ethan's back. He was still at the window, not moving. Mr. Walker? He turned. I can go into town, she said. Take a room at Halverson's. Distance myself from the situation here before the hearing. It removes his argument. It also leaves the ranch without help, Ethan said. You're well enough now to manage. That's not what I mean, he said. The look on his face was not complicated. It was, in fact, the simplest thing she'd seen on him, direct and unguarded, and carrying the specific quality of a man who had decided not to manage what he was feeling anymore. I won't have you pushed out, he said. Not by Marsh, not by Culver, not by anyone. Your position, Clara. He said her name the way he'd been saying it for the past week, without the miss, without ceremony, with the ease of something that had quietly become natural. I am not sending you away. Hale looked between them, with the expression of an attorney filing information for future reference. Then we proceed with the legal strategy, he said carefully, and we address the social dimension as directly as we can. He gathered his papers. The hearing is in 4 weeks. Get Calloway's documentation here as soon as possible. And, he paused at the door, keep out of town until then, both of you. Don't give Marsh additional material. He left. The sound of his horse faded down the road. Clara and Ethan stood in the kitchen, in the particular silence that follows someone else's departure. The silence that belongs only to the people who remain. 4 weeks, she said. 4 weeks, he agreed. She began clearing the coffee cups. He stayed where he was, watching her with an expression she had learned to read as him thinking something he hadn't yet decided whether to say. Say it, she said. I don't want you to go, he said. Not for the hearing, not after. I realize that's... He stopped. I realize that's not something I have any right to say. Clara set the cups in the basin and turned around. She looked at him the way she looked at things she wanted to understand fully before she responded steadily and without flinching. You can say it, she said. You just did. He held her gaze. Does it change anything? I don't know yet, she said honestly. Ask me in 4 weeks. He nodded once, turned, went outside to check the fence line. She watched him go, pressed her thumb over the scar on her arm, once a habit, not a wound, and went back to work. 12 days before the hearing, Clara rode into town. She needed medical supplies. The yarrow was running low, and Ethan's wound required continued treatment, though it was healing cleanly, and she needed flour and salt and 3 other things that couldn't wait. She went alone at Ethan's insistence that she take his better horse with the practical efficiency of a woman who intended to complete her errand and return without incident. Silver Creek looked different to her now than it had on that first day. The platform where she'd been abandoned was simply a platform. The road she'd walked with her nursing bag was simply a road. The town itself was what all frontier towns were, people making lives in difficult circumstances, some gracefully and some not. She tied the horse at the general store and went inside. The conversation didn't stop. It shifted, a subtle rearrangement of attention, the way a room's acoustics change when someone new enters, and Clara felt it land on her the way she'd felt rain coming before it arrived. Not dramatic, just real. She bought what she needed. The storekeeper, a heavy-set man named Orville, was professional and efficient, and only slightly careful, in a way that told her he'd heard things he was choosing not to repeat. She was almost done when the door opened behind her. Well. The voice was Harlan Greer's. She recognized it before she turned the particular self-satisfied cadence of a man who has decided the world arranges itself for his commentary. The mail-order woman. She did not turn immediately. She finished counting her change, returned her coin purse to her pocket, and then turned with the deliberate calm of someone who will not be hurried. Harlan looked the same as he had on the platform, broader than she remembered, or perhaps that was the enclosed space. He was with two other men, both of whom had the settled comfort of people who had never been the subject of the kind of attention Clara was currently receiving. "Mr. Greer," she said. "Didn't expect to see you still in Silver Creek," he said. The smile was expansive, designed for an audience. "Thought you'd have gone back east by now. A woman in your situation." "My situation is fine," Clara said. "Thank you for your concern." "Is it?" He tilted his head with the exaggerated thoughtfulness of someone performing consideration. "The way I heard it, you've been out at Walker's place this whole time, living there, without a husband, without a chaperone, without any—" He spread his hands. "Well, without any propriety." "The way I heard it," Clara said evenly, "a man left a woman stranded on a train platform because he didn't like the look of her arm. I imagine the town has an opinion about that too." The two men behind Harlan exchanged a look. "That's different," Harlan said, and there was an edge under the pleasantness now. "Is it?" she said. "You made a commitment. You broke it. Without a word, without an explanation, without the basic human courtesy of telling a woman you'd brought 300 miles that you'd changed your mind. And then," she kept her voice entirely level, "you stood in this town and let people talk about her." "Nobody left a woman anywhere," Harlan said, the pleasantness dropping entirely now. "I looked at what I was getting and I made a different decision. That's my right." "It is," Clara said. "And my response to that decision is my right. I found work. I helped someone who was ill. I did what needed doing." She picked up her packages from the counter. "Whatever story you've been telling about me in this town, Mr. Greer, it says more about the person telling it than the person it's told about." She walked out. She got to the horse. She tied the packages to the saddle with hands that were entirely steady. She untied the reins mounted and rode to the end of the street. Then she stopped. Because Pete Culver was standing in front of the land office with two men she didn't recognize, and he was gesturing in a way that made her stomach tighten, and the words she caught on the wind as she passed were enough Walker's Ranch. That woman. Marsh. The hearing. She rode home without stopping. Chabag. She didn't tell Ethan about Harlan immediately. She put away the supplies. She checked the wound healing well. The last of the infection cleared the new skin growing over cleanly. She made dinner. She ate dinner. She did all of this with the characteristic efficiency that she used as scaffolding when she needed something to hold her together. It was Ethan who noticed. "What happened?" he said, not a question. "I saw Harlan Greer in the store," she said. He set down his fork. "What did he say?" She told him. She kept it concise and accurate with no editorializing the way she handled all information that needed to be transmitted clearly. When she finished, Ethan's face was very still. "Clara, I handled it," she said. "I said what needed to be said and I left." "That's not—" He stopped, started again. "I should have been there." "You shouldn't have been in town," she said. "Hale said—" "I don't care what Hale said." He pushed back from the table. "That man left you on a platform, and now he's standing in the general store telling stories about you." "Ethan." She said his name the way he said hers, without ceremony, without distance, with the quiet authority of someone who has earned the right to use a person's name like that. "Sit down." He sat down. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite anger. Anger had a different quality, hotter and more diffuse. This was more concentrated, more specific. "I have been managing people's opinions about me since I was 7 years old," she said. "The scar does something to people. It makes them certain they know something about me before I've said a word. I have been dealing with that my whole life." She met his gaze. "Harlan Greer is not the worst version of that. He's just the most recent." "That doesn't make it right," Ethan said. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't, but it makes it manageable. And what I need from you right now isn't anger on my behalf." She paused. "What I need is to know that Culver was talking to people outside the land office today, and they looked like men who'd come from out of town, and one of them may have been connected to Marsh." Ethan was very still. "I couldn't hear enough," she said. But the way he was talking, it had that quality. The way people talk when they're arranging something rather than gossiping. He reached across the table. Not to take her hand, he stopped short of that, pulling the document box toward him instead. "I'll write to Hale tonight." "I already thought about what to say," Clara told him. "Write that we have reason to believe Marsh is coordinating with local witnesses ahead of the hearing. That Culver may be among them. Ask Hale to request disclosure of witness lists." Ethan looked at her. "You think of things quickly," he said. "Someone has to," she said, and began clearing the table. He wrote the letter. She washed the dishes. Outside, the wind picked up in the way it did before a change in weather, and neither of them talked about what was building the hearing, the rumors, the thing between them that had been growing in the space of shared purpose and daily proximity, and had not yet been named. The letter arrived 4 days before the hearing. It was not from Hale. It was not from Calloway. It was addressed to Clara, care of Crosswind Ranch, in handwriting she didn't recognize. She opened it at the table while Ethan was outside. She read it once. She set it down. She read it again. It was brief, unsigned. 12 words that had been chosen with the specific care of someone who wanted maximum damage with minimum accountability. "Leave Silver Creek before the hearing, or everyone will know why you really left Ohio." She sat with it for a long moment. There was nothing to know about why she'd left Ohio. She'd left Ohio because there was nothing left there, her grandmother gone. Her father's property sold to pay debts. Her prospects reduced to the choice between taking in laundry in a town where everyone knew every iteration of her situation, or writing letters to a rancher who'd advertised in the Gazette. She had left Ohio for the same reason people left anywhere, because staying had stopped being possible. But anonymous threats didn't require truth to be effective. They required only the suggestion of truth, the implication of a secret, the shadow of a story, and human nature would fill in the rest. She was still sitting with the letter when Ethan came in. He saw it on the table. He saw her face. "What is that?" he said. She handed it to him. He read it. The quality of his stillness changed, deepened, hardened, became the kind of stillness that precedes something rather than following it. "This is Marsh," he said. "Or someone working for him," she said. "Yes." "He's trying to frighten you into leaving before the hearing." "Because if I'm not here," Clara said, "if I leave under pressure before the hearing date, it looks like I had something to hide, which gives him ammunition to claim your whole position has been compromised by my presence." "He's not wrong that you being here has complicated things," Ethan said. "I know," Clara said, "but he's wrong about everything else." He set the letter down. "There's nothing in Ohio that can hurt you. Is there?" "No," she said. "I had a quiet life, and then I had less of it, and then I got on a train." "Then this is empty," he said. "It's empty," she agreed. "But it still landed." He looked at her, not at her arm, not at the letter, but at her face with the full attention she had come to understand was his particular form of care, complete and unperformed. "Are you frightened?" he said. The same question he'd asked after Marsh's visit. "A little," she said, which was a different answer from the last time, and they both understood what that meant, that the stakes had shifted, that she had more to lose now than she'd had 4 weeks ago, because she had come to want things she hadn't let herself want since the platform. "Good," he said quietly. She blinked. "Good. It means you're not leaving," he said. "People only get frightened about things they're staying for." She looked at him for a long moment. Something had changed in the room, or rather something that had been changing for weeks, had finally shifted far enough to be visible. "Ethan," she said. "Clara," he said. "Don't say it yet," she said. "Wait until the hearing is over." He held her gaze. "All right," he said. "I can wait." She nodded, once picked up the letter and carried it to the stove. She opened the door and put the letter in the fire and watched it go. "I'll need to pack for Billings," she said, her back to him. "We leave Thursday," he said. "I know." She closed the stove door. "I'll be ready." The day before they were to leave for Billings, the situation in town reached Crosswind Ranch in the form of old Margaret Aldrich. Mrs. Aldrich was the neighbor who had brought biscuits before Ethan's illness, the same biscuits Clara had soaked in broth those first desperate days. She was 70 years old and had the posture of a woman who had never once been uncertain about her right to go where she intended. She arrived in a small buggy, drove herself to the gate, and called out without getting down, "Walker, I need to speak to you and that young woman." They both came outside. Mrs. Aldrich looked at them with the comprehensive attention of someone who has been observing human nature for 7 decades and has very few illusions left about it. "There's going to be trouble at the hearing," she said. "I've heard things in town. Marsh has been talking to people I know, asking questions about Miss Bennett, trying to find someone who'll speak against her character. He's planning to bring it into the courtroom." She looked directly at Clara. "He couldn't find anything real, so he's going to manufacture something." "What does he plan to say?" Clara asked. "That you came here under false pretenses. That you targeted a grieving widower. That you've been manipulating the management of his property for your own benefit." Mrs. Aldrich said it with the flat directness of someone delivering medical information clearly and without softening. "He's going to make you sound like a schemer." "And people will believe him," Clara said. "Some will," Mrs. Aldrich said. "Others won't. That's why I'm here." She reached into the buggy and produced a folded document. "I've written a statement about what I observed in the weeks before Ethan's accident and the weeks after, about the state of this ranch and the difference between then and now. About the character of a woman I watched nurse a sick man back to health without once complaining or asking for payment." She held the document out. "I'll deliver it to Mr. Hale personally if you'd like." Clara reached up and took it. She unfolded it and read it. Her hands were not as steady as she would have liked. "Mrs. Aldrich," she said. "Don't thank me," the old woman said briskly. "I'm doing it because it's true, and because I am too old to watch a good woman get run over by a small man with money and lawyers." She picked up the reins. "Win in Billings. Come home, and plant more in the East Garden next spring. You've got good soil there you're not using." She drove back down the road without waiting for a response. Clara stood holding the letter. Ethan stood beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Come home," he said quietly, repeating Mrs. Aldrich's words. Clara looked up at him. "She said come home," he said, "not come back. Home." She looked down at the document in her hands. Her thumb pressed briefly over the scar on her arm, the old habit, the old reflex. Then she lowered her hand deliberately, consciously, the way you put something down you've been carrying too long. "Thursday," she said. "We leave Thursday." "Thursday," he agreed. She walked back inside. She put Mrs. Aldrich's statement carefully in the document box between Calloway's sworn testimony and the original deed. The box was full now. Full of evidence, full of truth, full of the accumulated documentation of 2 people who had built something without intending to, and were now walking into a courtroom to defend it. She closed the lid. She put her hands flat on top of it. 4 weeks ago, she had arrived in Silver Creek with a trunk and $3 and a life that had fallen apart on a train platform in front of strangers. She had not planned any of what came after. She had only kept choosing to stay. And somewhere between the fever and the fencing and the legal documents and the biscuits that came out right and the letter she'd burned in the stove and an old woman who'd said, "Come home," without thinking twice about it, somewhere in all of that staying had become something she didn't need to keep deciding. It had simply become what she did. Thursday came. They left before sunrise. Clara with the document box, Ethan with the look of a man riding toward something he intended to win, and the road to Billings opened in front of them in the early gray light, long and straight, and requiring everything they had. She didn't look back at the ranch. She didn't need to. The road to Billings took 2 days. They stopped the first night at a way station, the kind of place that existed purely for the functional purpose of rest and feed, with no pretension toward comfort and no apology for it. Clara took the small room at the back. Ethan took the common room with 3 other travelers. They ate at the same table and spoke about practical things: the sequence of documents, the order in which Hale intended to present the evidence, the specific language Calloway had used in his sworn statement, and whether it would hold up under questioning. They did not speak about what Mrs. Aldrich had said. They did not speak about what Ethan had said in the kitchen the night before the anonymous letter went into the fire. They ate their food and managed their documents and went to their separate rooms, and Clara lay in the narrow bed in the dark and listened to the way stations settle into the night around her and thought about Thursday. Not the hearing. Thursday itself. The way he'd said, "We leave Thursday," with the quiet certainty of a man who had stopped thinking about it as a possibility and had started thinking about it as a fact. She slept. She woke before sunrise. She was ready before he was, which did not surprise either of them. They arrived in Billings on a Friday afternoon, with the hearing scheduled for Monday morning. Hale had arranged accommodation, 2 separate rooms at a clean hotel that asked no questions and provided adequate breakfast, and he met them in the lobby with his satchel and the specific expression of an attorney who has done everything possible and is now in the business of managing what he can't control. "Calloway's documentation arrived yesterday," he said. "It's everything we needed. The witness record is clear, the dating is unambiguous, and his signature has been notarized in Helena." He paused. "Marsh's attorney has filed a motion to exclude it on procedural grounds." "On what grounds?" Clara said. "That it was submitted outside the standard disclosure window." "It wasn't," she said. "We sent the initial request within the 10-day response period. The delay in receipt was due to the postal distance from Helena. That's documented in the postmark." Hale looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what I'll argue. I wanted to see if you'd caught it." "I caught it," she said. Ethan said nothing, but she felt him looking at the side of her face in the way he'd been looking at her for weeks, with the settled attention of a man who has stopped being surprised and started being grateful. "There's something else," Hale said. His tone shifted a drop in register that Clara had learned to identify as the precursor to information he'd rather not deliver. "Marsh has filed a supplementary argument. He's claiming that the presence of an unattached woman at the property during the period in question represents a pattern of financial manipulation. He's going to argue that you," he looked at Clara, "that you came to Crosswind Ranch specifically to position yourself for financial benefit in the event of Walker's death or incapacitation." The lobby was very quiet. "He's going to say she came there to take something," Ethan said very flatly. "That's the argument," Hale said. "That's a lie," Ethan said. "It's a strategy," Hale said. "And I need to know." He turned to Clara. "I need to know if there's anything in your history he could use to make it credible. Anything at all. I won't be caught without a response." Clara looked at him with the direct, unhurried gaze she brought to every question that deserved an honest answer. "I arrived in Silver Creek with $3.40, she said. "I had no knowledge of Ethan Walker before Arthur Briggs at the station mentioned him. I walked 7 miles to the ranch because I had nowhere else to go, and a man was reported ill. I have taken no money from this property, accepted no payment, and made no claim on anything belonging to Mr. Walker." She paused. "Arthur Briggs will confirm the first part. Mrs. Aldrich's statement confirms the rest. And Briggs, would he testify?" "Send him a letter tonight," Clara said. "I'll tell you what to write." Hale looked at Ethan. Ethan was looking at Clara. "She'll tell you what to write," Ethan said. The weekend before the hearing had the quality of held breath. Saturday was documents review rehearsal. Hale walking Ethan through exactly what he would say and in what order. Clara sitting to the side making notes when she caught inconsistencies or gaps. Sunday was quieter. Hale went to church. Ethan did not. Clara did not. They sat in the small hotel parlor in the mid-morning with coffee going cold between them and the silence of 2 people who have run out of preparable things and have arrived at the territory where only the thing itself can happen. "Tell me about Ruth," Clara said. He looked at her. She met his gaze steadily. "You don't have to," she said. I'm asking because I want to understand you, not because I need to." He looked at his coffee for a moment. "She was from Missouri," he said. "She came west with her family when she was 16, and I met her 2 years later. She was—" He stopped, reorganized. "She was the kind of person who made things make sense, not by explaining them, just by being nearby." A pause. "When she died, things stopped making sense for a long time." "How?" Clara asked. "Everything I did felt—" He searched for the word. "Approximate. Like I was doing the right motions without the right meaning behind them." She understood that. She understood it precisely. "My grandmother was like that," she said. "After she died, I kept having the thought that I should tell her things. Not sad things, just things that happened during the day. And then I'd remember." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Exactly like that." They sat with it for a moment, the shared recognition of two people who have been through the specific grief of losing the person who made the world legible. "It's been 2 years," he said finally. "I know," she said. "Things have started making sense again," he said. "Recently." She looked at her coffee cup. "Clara," he said. "Monday first," she said quietly. "Let's get through Monday." "All right," he said. "Monday first." But when she stood to go back upstairs, he reached out and caught her hand, not dramatically, not urgently, just a brief and deliberate contact. His fingers around hers for one moment before he let go. She carried that up the stairs with her and didn't examine it until she was alone. And even then, she only let herself feel it for a few minutes before she put it somewhere safe and went to sleep. Monday came the way important days always come, with indifferent weather and ordinary breakfast, and the specific unreality of a morning that will divide your life into before and after. The courtroom in Billings was small and functional, and carried the smell of wood polish and accumulated human stress. Hale was already there when they arrived, arranging papers with the focused calm of a man in his element. Clara and Ethan sat behind him at the plaintiff's table and did not speak. Gerald Marsh was across the room with his attorney, a tall man named Fitch, who had the practiced ease of someone who regularly made things that were wrong look reasonable. Marsh looked at Clara when she sat down, and then looked away, and that controlled indifference told her everything about how confident he was. Judge Pearson entered, 60-something, deliberate, with the face of a man who had heard everything twice and been surprised very little. He took his seat, reviewed the papers in front of him, and looked up. "We're here on the matter of Marsh versus Walker," he said. "Regarding the deed and title to Crosswind Ranch, Silver Creek District. Counsel, are we ready?" "Ready, Your Honor," Fitch said. "Ready," Hale said. "Then we'll begin." Fitch opened with the motion to exclude Calloway's documentation, the procedural argument that Clara had identified at the hotel, the claim that the submission window had been missed. He made it sound technical and inevitable, the kind of argument that wins not on merit but on complexity, and Clara watched the judge's face as he listened and tried to read whether Pearson was the kind of man who rewarded complexity or cut through it. Hale's response was clean and direct. The postmarks, the documented timeline, the clear sequence of the initial request falling within the disclosure period. He set the postal records in front of the judge with the quiet confidence of a man who had been handed exactly the right tool at exactly the right moment. Pearson reviewed them. He looked at Fitch. "Motion denied," he said. "The documentation is admitted." Marsh across the room did not visibly react, but his attorney's jaw tightened by a fraction, and Clara filed that away. The deed question came next. Hale presented the original filing, the dating, the clear chain of ownership. Fitch challenged the timing of Ruth's signature, his whole case resting on the claim that she had signed under circumstances that compromised her judgment. Hale called the notarized statement from Reverend Calloway, read it into the record with the careful precision of a man who understood that every word mattered, and then placed the original witness documentation from the minister's personal files on the judge's bench. Pearson read it. He read it slowly, in the way that judges read things when they're not looking for a reason to dismiss, but a reason to decide. When he set it down, his expression had not changed, but something in the quality of his attention had. "Mr. Fitch," he said, "your client's claim rests on the assertion that the signature was improperly obtained. Reverend Calloway's contemporaneous record indicates that Mrs. Walker signed the deed voluntarily and with full understanding of its implications. He was present. He documented it at the time. Do you have evidence that contradicts his account?" Fitch stood. "We have reason to believe—" "Evidence," Pearson said. "Not reason to believe. Evidence." A silence. "We have witness testimony," Fitch said, "regarding the general state of the Walker household during the relevant period, which we believe casts doubt." "I'll hear it," Pearson said. "Yeah." This was where it changed. Fitch called Pete Culver first. Culver took the stand with the comfortable bearing of a man who had told his story several times in preparation and was confident in it. He spoke about the state of Crosswind Ranch. He spoke about Ethan's grief after Ruth's death. He spoke about Clara's arrival, the irregularity of it, the impropriety of it, the way it had struck him as unusual from the beginning. He did not say anything specific. He said nothing that was precisely false. He built an impression with accumulated innuendo, the way you build a wall with stones that have no mortar, each one insufficient alone, but together suggesting solidity. Hale cross-examined with the focused efficiency of someone who had anticipated every stone. "Mr. Culver, you visited Crosswind Ranch the day after Miss Bennett's arrival. Is that correct?" "That's correct." "What was the condition of the ranch at that time?" Culver hesitated. "It had been neglected. Walker was ill." "And on subsequent visits, let's say 2 weeks later, what was the condition of the ranch?" Another hesitation. "It had improved. Significantly." "Yes." "Who was responsible for that improvement?" Culver looked at Clara. "Miss Bennett had been working on things." "Miss Bennett had been working," Hale repeated for the room. "Without payment. Without prior arrangement. On behalf of a man she had not known before her arrival." He paused. "Does that sound to you like the behavior of someone pursuing financial manipulation?" "I can't speak to her motivations." "No," Hale said. "You can't. Thank you, Mr. Culver." Then Fitch moved to his real weapon. He did not call another witness immediately. He stood and addressed the judge directly, pivoting to the supplementary argument, the one about Clara. He laid it out with the careful construction of a man who knows the legal foundation is weak, but the human reaction might be strong. The irregular arrival, the suspicious convenience of a woman appearing at a vulnerable man's property, the question of who benefited from the relationship that had developed. Clara sat very still. Ethan's hand under the table found hers. She did not pull away. Fitch was building to something. She could hear the structure of it, the way a person who has processed a great deal of argumentation can hear when language is reaching toward a conclusion. He was going to say something specific, something designed to land. "Your Honor," Fitch said, "we would like to present evidence regarding Miss Bennett's origins and the nature of her departure from Ohio, which we believe will illuminate." "Mr. Hale," Pearson said. Hale was already standing. "Your Honor, I'd like to know what evidence counsel believes he has regarding Miss Bennett's private history, given that she is not a party to this proceeding." "She is materially relevant to the question of Mr. Walker's judgment. His judgment about whom he allows on his property," Hale said, "is not the subject of this hearing. The deed is the subject of this hearing. The deed, the signature, and the documentation of its validity. Miss Bennett's history in Ohio has no bearing on whether a signature made 2 years before her arrival was made freely." Pearson looked at Fitch. "Counsel." Fitch recalibrated. She could see at the strategic pivot of a man whose best weapon had just been ruled out of bounds. He shifted to Arthur Briggs's potential testimony, to the question of whether Ethan's state of mind during his illness had compromised his subsequent endorsement of the deed, a tortured argument that required the listener to follow several logical steps that didn't quite connect. Hale dismantled it piece by piece with the same quiet, methodical precision he'd brought to everything else. And then Pearson called Ethan to speak. Ethan stood at the front of the courtroom, with the straight-backed, unhurried bearing of a man who had spent 34 years in physical honesty, who used his body the way he used his words, without waste and without performance. He told the truth about the deed. He told the truth about Ruth, about the signing, about the minister, about the morning it happened, and what Ruth had said, and what he had said, and what Calloway had written in his records that day. He spoke about his wife with a plainness that made the truth of it impossible to question, and Clara watched several people in the public gallery shift in their seats with the unconscious physical response of people encountering something real. Then Fitch cross-examined. "Mr. Walker, Miss Bennett arrived at your ranch in early July. Is that correct?" "It is." "Under what arrangement?" "No arrangement. She came because she had nowhere else to go, and I needed help." "And in the time since her arrival, has she made any claims on the property?" "None." "Has she made any claims on your personal circumstances?" Ethan looked at Fitch with the calm, measuring regard of a man who understands exactly what is being implied and has decided precisely how to respond to it. "No," he said. "She has made no claims on anything. She has given help when it was needed, done work that required doing, and conducted herself with more integrity than anyone else I have encountered in the past 2 years." He paused. "Including the people in this courtroom who have seen fit to question hers." Fitch moved on quickly. He asked about the ranch's financial state, about the hearing notice, about the timeline. He was looking for a crack, a place where something Ethan said could be turned sideways to suggest something he hadn't said, and he didn't find one because Ethan spoke with the plain and undecorated accuracy of a man who was simply reporting what had happened. When it was over, Ethan came back to the table and sat down. He didn't look at Clara. He looked at Hale. "Good," Hale said quietly. "Very good." Clara reached under the table and pressed her hand briefly over his. Once. Then she moved it back. The closing arguments were where Fitch made his last attempt. He had abandoned the attack on Clara directly. Hale had made that too costly, but he wove her presence through his final summary as a recurring thread of implication. A disrupted household. An unusual arrangement. A man whose judgment during illness and grief could not be fully trusted. He made it sound like concern. He made it sound like he was protecting the memory of a dead woman from the exploitation of a stranger. It was well done. Clara could acknowledge that. She sat and listened, and felt the shape of it, the way it pressed on the room, the way some faces in the gallery absorbed it. Then Hale stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform. He simply laid it out. The deed, the signature, the minister's record, the postmarks, the timeline, with the sequential clarity of a man presenting a thing that was true and trusting that truth properly arranged was sufficient. And then he said, "Your Honor, this case is not complicated. A man's wife signed a deed freely in the presence of a witness before a minister documented at the time. The record is clear. The attempt to obscure it has relied not on contradicting that record, because it cannot be contradicted, but on casting doubt on the people involved in order to distract from the fact that the record exists and is unambiguous." He paused. Gerald Marsh did not bring this action to protect his sister's legacy. He brought it because he wants the land. The record shows he is not entitled to it. We ask the court to say so clearly. Pearson took 20 minutes. 20 minutes in which the courtroom held its collected breath, in which Marsh sat with his particular controlled stillness, in which Fitch arranged and rearranged papers that did not need arranging, in which Ethan sat with his hands flat on the table and Clara sat beside him and did not move. Pearson returned. "The deed to Crosswind Ranch filed in the summer of 1885 is valid," he said. "The signature of Ruth Walker was obtained freely and under no duress as documented by a credible contemporaneous witness. Gerald Marsh's claim to partial ownership is without legal foundation and is hereby dismissed." He set down his papers. He looked at the room. "This case is closed." The sound Marsh made was not dramatic. It was a single controlled exhalation. The sound of a man absorbing a loss he had not fully prepared for, and then he stood, said something quietly to Fitch, and left the courtroom without looking at Ethan or Clara. Fitch followed. The gallery began to stir. Hale turned around. He was smiling, not the professional courtesy smile, but something more genuine, something that reached his eyes. "Well done," he said, and the compliment was directed at both of them equally, which Clara noted. Ethan stood. He extended his hand, and Hale shook it. Then Ethan turned. He looked at Clara with an expression that was not relief. Relief was too small for what was on his face. It was the look of a man arriving somewhere he had not known he was traveling toward and finding it exactly right. "We won," she said. "We won," he said. She stood up. Her legs were steadier than she expected. The document box was on the chair beside her. Calloway's statement, Mrs. Aldrich's letter, the deed, the postmarks, all of it, and she picked it up with both hands the way you carry something that matters. "I'd like to go home," she said. Something happened in his face at that word, the same thing that had happened when Mrs. Aldrich had used it. But fuller now, more settled, landing differently, because she was the one saying it, and she was saying it about a place that had been his alone for 2 years. "Home," he said. "Crosswind Ranch," she said. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment in the emptying courtroom, in the particular light of a Montana afternoon, through dusty windows, with Hale discreetly occupying himself with his satchel nearby. "Clara," he said. "Ethan," she said. "I'm not waiting anymore," he said. "No," she agreed. "You don't have to." He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and took her face in both his hands, weathered, careful, certain, and kissed her once clearly, and without any ambiguity about what it meant or where it was going. Hale's satchel made a small sound of being set down and then picked up again. When Ethan stepped back, his hands were still holding her face for one more moment, and his expression was the simplest thing she'd ever seen on him. "I've been wanting to do that since the biscuits," he said. "The biscuits," she repeated. "The first morning. When you made them, and they were perfect, and you handed them to me like it was completely ordinary." He lowered his hands. "It wasn't ordinary." "No," she said. "I suppose it wasn't." They walked out of the courtroom together into the afternoon, and the document box was in her arms, and the road home was 2 days ahead of them, and neither of them was in any hurry because they were going in the same direction, and that was the only thing that mattered. They stopped the second night at the same way station as before. This time they sat outside after dinner. The other travelers had gone. In the night was quiet and talked in a way they hadn't before. Not about documents, not about the ranch, not about what needed doing. Just talk the way people talk when the immediate problem has been solved, and what remains is the larger question of who they are to each other. He told her more about Ruth. She let him. She asked the questions that needed asking, and didn't ask the ones that didn't. And what she learned was that Ethan Walker had loved his wife with the particular devotion of a man who commits completely and recovers slowly, and that the 2 years since her death had been a long excavation of grief that had finally recently reached something like ground. She told him about Ohio, about her grandmother's kitchen and the bread recipe and the land disputes and the newspaper advertisement she'd answered with the careful, considered hope of a woman who had spent 25 years being practical and had decided it was time to try for something more. "I thought Harlan Greer was the best I could do," she said. Not with self-pity, she wasn't built for self-pity, but with the frank honesty of a woman assessing past judgment. "He's not," Ethan said. "I know that now," she said. "You knew it then," he said. "On the platform. That's why you didn't cry." She looked at him. "How do you know I didn't cry?" "Because you're you," he said simply. She was quiet for a moment. "That might be the most accurate thing anyone has ever said about me." He reached over and took her hand, not urgently, not hesitantly, with the settled ease of a man who has arrived somewhere and intends to stay. She let him. Above them, the Montana sky was doing what Montana skies do, conducting its vast, indifferent display of stars, with no concern whatsoever for the 2 people sitting under it, having the quiet, consequential conversation of 2 lives beginning to decide they might go in the same direction. "When we get back," Ethan said. "Yes," she said. "The East Garden," he said. "Mrs. Aldrich was right. We've got soil there we're not using." Clara looked at the side of his face. "We," she said. "We," he said without apology or amendment. She turned back to the sky. Her hand was warm in his. The road home was one day ahead. "All right," she said. "The East Garden." And that was enough. For now, that was everything. They came home to a ranch that had been waiting. Not the dramatic waiting of something forsaken. Not the desolation Clara had walked into that first July afternoon with her nursing bag and $3 and nowhere else to go. The ranch had been tended in their 4-day absence by Billy, who had taken the responsibility with the earnest reliability of a young man who understood that this particular job mattered, and what greeted them when the wagon turned through the gate was a property that looked unmistakably like a place someone cared about. Clara noticed it before Ethan did, the water trough freshly filled, the barn door properly latched, the vegetable garden's east rows standing straight in the late afternoon light. "Billy did well," she said. "Billy always does well when you give him clear instructions," Ethan said. "He told me once you're the only person who explains things without making him feel stupid for not knowing them already." She absorbed that quietly. "He's a good worker. He deserves a proper wage. I've been thinking the same thing." Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop. He sat for a moment without getting down, looking at the ranch with the expression she had learned to read as him, taking stock, adding things up, arriving at a number. "I've been thinking about a lot of things." "I know," she said. He turned to look at her. The afternoon light caught the angles of his face. The weathering, the steadiness, the thing in his eyes that had been there since the courtroom and hadn't gone anywhere since. "We need to talk about what comes next." "We do," she agreed. "Inside," he said. "Inside," she said. He helped her down from the wagon with the particular care of a man who had decided that small gestures mattered and was going to act accordingly. She didn't need the help, she hadn't needed it the first day, and she didn't need it now. But she accepted it because there was a difference between not needing something and not wanting it, and she had spent enough of her life confusing those two things. Inside the cabin had the specific quality of a place that had learned to be lived in again. Clara had done that slowly without announcement in the way she did everything. The curtain on the straight rod, the organized larder, the document box on its shelf, the chair by the window where she sat in the evenings after the work was done reading or mending or simply sitting, which was something she hadn't done without guilt for most of her adult life and had quietly learned to do again here. She put water on for coffee. Old habit. Necessary ritual. Ethan sat at the table, the same table where they'd worked through legal documents and eaten eggs and passed letters back and forth and built without entirely intending to the daily architecture of a shared life. "I want to ask you something," he said. She kept her back to him, measuring coffee. "All right." "Look at me when I ask it." She turned. He was sitting with both hands flat on the table, the posture she recognized from the courtroom, from the serious moments, from the times when he wanted to be certain nothing about his body was saying something his words weren't. "I know this hasn't been. I know it started because you had nowhere to go and I needed help. I know that's not a story anyone would write on purpose." "No," she agreed. "It isn't. But I also know what it is now," he said. "Whatever it started as. I know what it is now." He held her gaze with the unwavering directness that was simply how he was, no performance, no management, just Ethan Walker telling the truth in the plainest language available. "I want you to stay. Not because the ranch needs a second pair of hands. Not because you're useful, though you are, and I'd be a liar if I said that didn't matter. But because—" He stopped. He wasn't a man who talked around things, but this required finding the exact word and not a substitute. "Because the ranch isn't the only thing that came back to life this summer." The coffee water was boiling. She didn't move. "I want to marry you, Clara," he said, "if you'll have me. Not because it's practical, or because it's proper, or because it solves anyone's problem. Because I want to spend the rest of my life sitting at this table with you." She looked at him for a long moment. "The East Garden," she said. He blinked. "I'm sorry. You said we. When we got back. You said we've got soil there we're not using. She held his gaze. You said it like it was already decided. Something moved across his face, the fractional adjustment, the recalibration, but warmer than she'd ever seen it. It was already decided, he said. On my end. I was waiting on yours. You could have asked sooner, she said. You told me to wait until after the hearing. I told you not to say it yet, she said. I didn't say anything about asking. He looked at her with the expression of a man absorbing a fine distinction and finding it entirely fair. You're right, he said. I should have asked sooner. Yes, she said. You should have. Clara. Yes, she said. That's my answer. Yes. He stood up from the table. She stood where she was. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her hands, both of them the scarred one and the other, with no distinction and no hesitation, and held them the way you hold something you don't intend to put down. Yes, she said again quietly to make it real. Yes, Ethan. The water boiled over on the stove. Neither of them moved to fix it. They told Mrs. Aldrich first. It seemed right. The old woman had called it home before either of them had used the word aloud, and she had stood in a courtroom's shadow and offered her name in defense of a woman she'd known for less than 2 months, and that deserved to be honored with the news before it traveled the ordinary way, which in Silver Creek meant through Pete Culver's commentary within 48 hours. Mrs. Aldrich received them in her kitchen on a Wednesday morning, looked at their faces before either of them spoke, and set a 3rd cup on the table. Well, she said, finally. We got back 2 days ago, Ethan said. I know when you got back, she said. I'm talking about this. She gestured between them with the blunt economy of a woman who had no patience for indirection. Sit down. They sat. She poured coffee. She sat across from them and looked at Clara with the assessing attention of someone checking the quality of a thing she'd helped build. You look settled, she said. I am settled, Clara said. Good. She turned to Ethan. You look like a man who's been carrying something heavy for 2 years and put it down. Yes, he said simply. Good, she said again. She picked up her coffee. When? We haven't decided yet, Clara said. Don't wait too long, Mrs. Aldrich said. Not because of what people say. Because life is short and the East Garden needs tending and you're both already home. She sipped her coffee. I'll bake the cake. You don't have to, Clara started. I'll bake the cake. Mrs. Aldrich repeated with the finality of a woman who has decided something and considers the discussion concluded. Clara looked at Ethan. He was looking at Mrs. Aldrich with the expression of a man who had given up arguing with forces of nature. She'll bake the cake, he said. She'll bake the cake, Clara agreed. The church gathering was in the 3rd week of September. It was the annual Harvest Assembly, the gathering that Silver Creek held every year, where the community came together in the way that frontier communities did, out of both genuine fellowship and the practical understanding that winter was coming and people needed to know where they stood with each other. Ethan had not attended in 2 years. He had not attended the one the autumn after Ruth died, and he had not attended last year, and everyone in Silver Creek had understood in the way small communities understand things that they don't say aloud that this was what grief looked like in a man who expressed it through absence. Clara had not attended before because she had not been here before. They went together. She wore the dark blue dress she'd had made before leaving Ohio, the one that was practical, rather than fine, that she'd put on the morning she arrived, hoping to make a good impression on a man who had taken one look at her arm and left. She'd folded it away since then. She brought it out now and shook it and wore it without ceremony because it was her best dress, and this was the occasion, and because she had stopped letting Harlan Greer's reaction define what the dress meant. Ethan noticed when she came out. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the courthouse, with the settled open regard of a man who had stopped managing his expressions and said nothing, which said everything. They drove into town in the wagon. They arrived at the church as the gathering was beginning, and the reaction to their arrival moved through the assembled crowd with the particular speed of information traveling through a small community. Not dramatic, not a collective gasp, but a shift in attention, a reorientation of awareness that Clara felt against her skin like a change in the direction of wind. She held Ethan's arm and walked in. The first 10 minutes were the particular kind of uncomfortable that only small towns can produce. The smiling too directly, the conversations that started and redirected slightly, the careful navigation of people who were still deciding what they thought. She was used to this. She had been navigating versions of this her entire life. She kept her posture straight, and her expression open, and her responses warm, but not seeking, and she let people make up their minds at whatever pace they needed. It was going reasonably well until Harlan Greer crossed the room. He came toward them with the deliberate bearing of a man who had decided in advance how this interaction was going to go. He had a drink in his hand, and the expansive confidence of someone who was on familiar ground and knew it. "Walker," he said, "heard about the Billings verdict. Congratulations." "Gerald Marsh sends his regards, I'm sure," Ethan said. Harlan's smile didn't waver. "And Miss Bennett." He looked at her with the same assessing quality he'd turned on her at the platform, the rapid inventory, the calculation, and then his gaze dropped brief and deliberate to her arm. "Still in Silver Creek?" "Still in Silver Creek," Clara said pleasantly. "Thought you might have moved on by now," he said. "Found a situation more suitable." "I found a situation perfectly suitable," she said. "Thank you for your concern. People have been talking," Harlan said, not quietly, not discreetly, at the volume of a man who intends to be overheard. "About the arrangement out at Crosswind Ranch. About what kind of woman, Harlan?" Ethan's voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. It carried the specific quality of a man who has decided where the line is and is informing you that you have reached it. You're going to want to stop that sentence. "I'm only saying what people—" "You left a woman alone on a train platform," Ethan said, still at the same even volume, "because you didn't like the look of her arm. And then you stood in this town and told stories about her while she was saving a dying man's life 7 miles away." He looked at Harlan with the clear, unhurried gaze of someone who has decided that the truth doesn't require volume to carry. "You want to talk about what kind of woman Clara Bennett is. I'll save you the time. She is the most capable, most honest, most genuinely decent person I have met in my adult life. And she is going to be my wife." The room had gone quiet, the way rooms go quiet when something real is being said in them. Harlan's face moved through several expressions in rapid sequence: surprise, recalibration, the beginning of a counter-argument, and then, looking at Ethan's face and finding absolutely nothing there that left room for negotiation, he settled on a thin, controlled smile. "Well," he said, "I wish you both the best." "No, you don't," Ethan said. "But that's all right." Harlan walked away. Clara became aware that she had been holding her breath only when she released it. Beside her, Ethan had not moved, still standing with the same settled stance, looking at the direction Harlan had gone, with the expression of a man who had said what needed saying and was satisfied with the accuracy of it. "Ethan," she said quietly. He turned to look at her. "You said wife," she said. "I know what I said. In front of the whole room. I know where we are," he said. "I meant for them to hear it." She looked at him. This man who used 12 words where others used 50, who expressed care through action and attention, and the careful, deliberate use of exactly the right word at exactly the right moment. And she felt something she had been holding at a careful distance, as though it might not be reliable, settle fully and completely into place. "All right then," she said. "All right," he agreed. And then from across the room, Margaret Aldrich's voice carrying with the confident volume of a woman who has decided the social temperature needs adjusting. "Clara, come here and meet the Hendersons. Dorothy Henderson has been asking about your vegetable garden since July, and I told her you'd tell her everything she needed to know." The spell, if it could be called that, broke cleanly and productively. Clara squeezed Ethan's arm once and went to meet the Hendersons. What happened after that had the quality of a tide turning, not all at once, not with any dramatic announcement. Tides don't work that way, and neither did Silver Creek. But Dorothy Henderson, who had been cautious with her welcome until this moment, drew Clara into a conversation about soil and growing seasons with the genuine warmth of one practical woman recognizing another, and Dorothy's husband James nodded at Ethan across the room with the brief unornamented acknowledgement that men in frontier communities offered when they'd made up their minds about a person. Reverend Marsh, a different Marsh from the one in Billings, an old man who had buried half the town's founders and married their children, came to speak with Ethan about the hearing verdict with the careful respect of someone who had read Calloway's statement and understood what it represented. One by one the room adjusted. Not everyone. Pete Culver stayed on the far side of the gathering and did not come to speak to either of them, and two women who had clearly been subscribers to a particular version of the story kept their distance with the specific avoidance of people who've invested in a narrative they can't quite abandon yet. Clara noticed them and did not pursue their approval because she had spent 25 years understanding that some people's good opinion was not worth the price of obtaining it. But the room by and large adjusted, and adjusting was enough. When Harlan Greer left early, slipping out with his drink and his calculation, hardly anyone noticed. They were married in October. Mrs. Aldrich baked the cake, a solid, serious cake with dried fruit and good flour, the kind that lasted and didn't fall apart in the cutting. Reverend Marsh performed the ceremony in the church on a Tuesday morning with Billy as witness, and Mrs. Aldrich and the Hendersons in attendance, which was exactly the right number of people for two private individuals making a public commitment. Clara wore the blue dress again. She had decided some time ago that it deserved better associations than the ones she'd been giving it, and this was the occasion to reassign them permanently. Ethan wore his good shirt and his good hat, and the expression of a man who has arrived at something he intends to keep. When Reverend Marsh asked if she took this man, Clara said yes, with the same directness she brought to everything clear and unambiguous and requiring no repetition. When the Reverend asked if Ethan took this woman, he said yes, and then he said her name, Clara, which the Reverend hadn't asked for, and which made Mrs. Aldrich in the front pew make a small sound that might have been approval. Afterward, at the table where Mrs. Aldrich served the cake, and Billy poured coffee with the careful concentration of a young man trying very hard not to spill anything ceremonial, Dorothy Henderson leaned toward Clara and said, "You're going to be good for this town, you know. Not because of what you do, because of how you do it." Clara accepted this without deflection. "Thank you, Dorothy. I mean it," Dorothy said. "People here needed to see that. A woman who showed up with nothing and built something. We all need reminding it's possible. Clara looked across the table at Ethan, who was in conversation with James Henderson about the East Field and whether the soil drainage would support a second crop. Next spring, the most Ethan Walker kind of wedding conversation imaginable, and who glanced up at that moment and found her looking, and held it for exactly 1 second, with everything in his face that he'd never been able to say efficiently, and had learned to carry in his eyes instead. "Yes," Clara said, turning back to Dorothy. "I think we all do." The first snow came early that year, mid-November, a week before anyone was quite ready for it, and Crosswind Ranch received it the way a place receives weather. It's prepared for with the quiet, functional readiness of a household that had spent the autumn getting its affairs in order. The East Garden had been planted in late September, cleared and turned and seeded with the specific varieties Clara had researched and Mrs. Aldrich had confirmed would winter well in Montana soil. The fence that had been down in 2 places in July was solid now. Ethan and Billy had spent 4 days on it in August, with proper materials and proper time. The larder was stocked. The cattle were accounted for. The barn door hung true on its hinges. The cabin was warm. Clara stood at the window with her coffee and watched the snow settle, the first snow of her first Montana winter, and took stock the way she took stock of everything, practically honestly, without sentimentality, but without denying what was real. She had come here with a trunk and $3 and a plan that had failed on a train platform in front of strangers. She had walked 7 miles in summer heat to a stranger's door, because she had no better option. She had stayed because a man needed help, and she knew how to give it. She had built something from those 3 facts, the way her grandmother had built things carefully with good materials, making sure everything was solid. She heard Ethan's boots on the porch. The door opened, bringing cold and the smell of morning and the sound of cattle settling, and then closed again. She heard him pull off his boots. She heard him cross to the stove and pour coffee without needing to ask where anything was, because he always knew where everything was now, because this was a house where two people had learned the geography of each other's habits and stopped needing to announce them. He came to stand beside her at the window. They stood in the particular silence of two people who don't need to fill the space between them with sound, who have earned through the slow accumulation of difficult days and honest conversations and biscuits made and letters burned and legal arguments assembled in the dark, the right to simply exist beside each other without explanation. "Billy wants to know if we'll need him Thursday," Ethan said. "Tell him yes," Clara said. "The south fence needs 2 people." "I'll tell him." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. Outside, the snow was steady and unhurried. "Ethan." "Yes." "Do you think about it?" she said. "What would have happened if I hadn't walked out here that day?" He considered it genuinely, the way he considered everything, without the rush to reassurance that would have been easier but less honest. "Yes," he said. "Sometimes." "What do you think?" "I think I would have died," he said simply. "From the infection if I was unlucky, from the other thing if I wasn't." She looked at him. "The approximate feeling," he said. "The one I told you about in Billings. Doing the right motions without the right meaning." He looked out the window. "I was going through it. The ranch, the cattle, the legal fight with Marsh, all of it. But not—" He stopped, found the word. "Not toward anything." "And now," she said. He turned to look at her, this woman who had arrived with nothing and made everything different, and his expression was the clearest thing about him, open and certain, and entirely without the management that had been his armor for 2 years. "Now I know where I'm going," he said. She pressed her shoulder against his. He put his arm around her without making a ceremony of it. Outside, the snow kept falling on the repaired fences and the planted east garden and the properly latched barn, and the cattle moving slow and dark across the white field, and Crosswind Ranch held them both inside its warm and ordinary walls. Years later, travelers passing through Silver Creek would hear the story. The way it was told varied depending on who was telling it. Mrs. Aldrich told it practically with emphasis on the garden and the legal documents and the poultice that cleared the infection. Billy told it with the reverence of a young man who had watched something real happen at close range. Dorothy Henderson told it to her daughters as an example of what a woman with no resources but her own character could build. Reverend Marsh told it at funerals when he needed to remind people that the worst endings sometimes open into the best beginnings. What they all agreed on, every version, every telling, was this: the mail-order bride arrived in Silver Creek with nothing but a nursing bag and $3, and the refusal to believe that one man's bad judgment defined her worth. The cowboy was dying in a ranch that had forgotten how to be a home. She knocked on his door, not because she had a plan, but because she had nowhere else to go and someone needed help and she knew how to give it. And what grew from that, from the nursing and the legal documents and the biscuits and the burned letter and the courtroom, and the 10,000 ordinary shared moments that no story quite captures, was not the love that people expected when they looked at the two of them. It was something quieter and more lasting than that. Something built from the ground up with good materials by two people who knew what it cost to lose things and had chosen carefully and without illusion to build again. At Crosswind Ranch on the Tuesday in October, with snow already threatening in the northern clouds, and Mrs. Aldrich's cake on the table, and Billy trying not to spill the coffee, Clara Bennett became Clara Walker, and the ranch, which had been waiting to be a home again for 2 years, finally was. That was the story Silver Creek told. Not the one about the woman who was abandoned, not the one about the man who had given up. The one about what two broken people can build when they stop waiting to be whole first and simply begin.